Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
For 3 long years, Christians in the Holy Land of Syria, where many of Jesus' followers still speak his ancient language, Aramaic, have been terrorized, beheaded, burnt out, and had their churches, monasteries, and convents destroyed by the Western-backed Al-Qaeda revolutionaries. The also Christian Barack Obama and David Cameron governments have eagerly facilitated all of it, though largely using the money of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, those well-known friends of liberty.
The Christian church, however, has begun a peaceful fight back. Kidnapped nuns have been freed by strenuous diplomatic efforts, and the new pope has prayed openly for an end to the carnage and sectarianism. And now currently a high-profile group of Christians have just returned from a pilgrimage to Syria, where once Jesus walked.
We're glad to welcome 2 of the pilgrims, and at Easter time, on board the Sputnik now. Father Dave Smith, you first, because it is Easter. Tell us about this pilgrimage. Who was on it? What did they do? How were they received? How did you find things?
Look, it was beautiful. I mean, this is my second trip to Syria in the last 2 years, and I think there are about 40 of us this time. As last time, we were received with enormous generosity and hospitality. I mean, the Syrian people are beautiful people.
Did you fly directly into Damascus?
We came via Tehran this time, and that was fantastic as well. Again, we had an Iranian team with us, a number of Iranian sheikhs, and people from non-government organisations. I mean, Iran obviously has been very supportive of the Syrian government, but they weren't political people at all. They were activists, most of whom had cut their teeth on support for Palestine, and who were concerned now about Syria and wanting to lend their energies to efforts for reconciliation work there.
And the Damascus airport still open? You flew into that?
Yeah. No
How
problem.
was the security situation, first of all?
Broadly speaking, I felt an enormous sense of relief compared to the year before, whereas we were in Damascus and it felt like you were under siege. You know, and you'd go to bed at night and see the red glow of mortar fire all around you, you know, on the horizon. This year, gosh, we drove from Damascus to Latakia to Homs. You couldn't have done that a year ago.
You didn't see any war, you didn't hear any war.
We did, okay, and look, to be truthful, we had mortar shells land within 30 metres of our hotel. There were 2 people killed on our doorstep, for instance, so more possibly. And we were close to where there was violence happening. Still, it's terrible. But look, my feeling was certainly this war's basically won, and I think the Syrian people have won.
Now, the Syrian society is, of course, actually the best in the whole of the Middle East insofar as multiculturalism, multi-faith society is concerned.
Syria was like an oasis for Christians, especially, you know, across the Levant, really, in terms of freedom of worship. So, you know, this idea of sort of terrible divisions in Syrian societies, I think, is a myth.
Well, certainly a myth so far as the Muslim-Christian relations are concerned. Internal Muslim relations are a little more complicated, perhaps rather more complicated than that. Let's talk about the Christians first of all. They've been under siege now for 3 years by this Al-Qaeda phenomenon. How was the morale of the Christian community in Syria?
As I say, my experience is people are feeling that the Syrian people have won this. And certainly, I mean, let's be honest, it's not the Syrian Christians, I think, are all pro-Assad, but I think they're very anti the Takfiri, who are trying to destroy not just them, but their way of life and everything that goes with it. I felt, yeah, the Christians felt, I think, that the distress was coming to an end.
John Shipton, let me welcome you also to the Sputnik. We all met in Australia. Yes. Seems like a long time ago now. You are, of course, the father of Julian Assange, our friend, still under his own kind of siege in the Ecuador embassy. You were also on the pilgrimage. Yes. You share Father Dave's perspective on that?
Very much so. All the roads are open now. We're driving through along the roads. You can see all of the buildings that overlook the roads are partially destroyed as the invaders attempted to isolate city from city and reduce the the community fabric of Syria to zero. And their savagery is, well, unmatched. For example, we were in Homs, and there's a shopping street with quite narrow, so that if you put a car bomb in the shopping street, it affects the shops. And so barbers will be blown up, and mothers and children shopping for onions and potatoes will be destroyed. Secondly, they put another car bomb nearby, so when everybody in horror of this death and destruction of children and women shopping runs out to assist, the second car bomb goes out. And these are contained explosions which destroy every living thing.
These Western leaders are wearing their Christian hearts on their sleeves, and yet at the same time facilitating this very carnage of which you describe so powerfully.
Well, the technicians of empire are completely without moral, and they just pride themselves in the phrase to do what's necessary. And what's necessary for them is to have no rivals. And having no rivals means that they just destroy the fabric of communities that are attempting to trade with each other, speak with each other, attend each other's universities. So they'll do everything, anything, whatever to destroy that. That fabric we attempt in our pilgrimage to remake.
You traveled all the way from Australia with a delegation to Syria. How is this war in Syria being perceived there down under?
I think we're doing a little better than our American sisters and brothers, and it was great to be able to say, no, I'm not an American, you know. Well, there was some tension sometimes, you know what I mean? What are you doing here?
Yeah.
You know, but I think people picked at the same time, we're here because we're not representing that mainline view, because why are you wanting to destroy us? That's what people are feeling, and it's a good question. I mean, ordinary people, why do we want to kill them? OK, there's a bigger game being played, but they don't know anything about that. It's not their problem.
John very powerfully there, most powerfully, Father Dave, made the point about the hypocrisy of all this. It's kind of gigantic, this point, that we're ready to pay and arm and drum up media support for people that we would be terrified to have roaming around our own streets.
How the media game is played is almost mind-boggling. I mean, one of my last days there, we had the privilege of being invited by the president of the Olympic Committee of Syria, watching a disabled volleyball game taking place, and gosh, it was fantastic to see the commitment that, frankly, the government has to disabled athletes. But then we lunched with a wonderful group of their soccer players, one of whom their star players had been killed when a mortar shell landed in the middle of a soccer match in the field and killed one of the players and injured others. And I mean, for God's sake, who's going to say that's somebody trying to fight for democracy and freedom? I mean, there's just no way of interpreting these sorts of actions of barbarity. I mean, that's just a trivial instance in some ways, but we drove past Adra as well, you know, and I thinking only last Christmas, the people there had seen the heads of children hanging on the trees in a mockery of a sort of Christmas tree celebration, you know, and these sorts of things that go on. It's almost just beyond belief. And to think these people are supposedly Robin Hood and his merry men trying to topple evil prince is just such a demonic...
Well, I did say to William Hague, Mr. Hague, you've been wrong all your life, but you've never been insane before. This policy has to be on the edge of insanity, doesn't it?
God knows what's going on, really. But I mean, yeah,
so
for the sake of humanity.
You bring back tidings, at least, of some prospect of resurrection of Syrian society.
The spirit of the Syrians is very strong. I mean, everywhere we went, we found Syrians, they love their country, you know, but for the most part, they love their army and they love their president. And that's, I mean, let's be honest, if there's an election now, the current president will win.
Well, I read some analysis from anti-Assad people today conceding for the first time that I had seen that actually whether President Assad rigs the election or not, he'd win it. And that's a paradox in itself. We're told this is all being done because the Syrians hate their president, but even his enemies now acknowledge that in a free and fair election he'd win it.
Look, and I don't think it's necessarily because they all love him, but they all hate the alternative for the most understandable of reasons, because it threatens to destroy not all minority groups, but the entire Syrian way of life and culture.
Hold on to nurse for the fear of something worse. I mean, that's the attitude of many.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, the only possibility now of the political reform that Syria needs and the transition to democracy that it needs is if this insurrection by these foreign invaders is defeated.
We saw great signs of hope there too, I must say. Numbers, we met with some of the FSA fighters who were coming back. You know, I'm not saying they're switching sides. What they're doing is they're signing papers saying we're no longer going to fight. And we saw a Sheikh Tahan there who was instrumental in playing that mediatorial role, helping people to come back and to give up their arms. The dear father Franz, who was killed recently,
Yes,
apparently
in
was
Aleppo.
also in Aleppo, was also involved in that mediator work.
That's probably why he was killed.
Well, that was why he was killed. And I think it's a last desperate attempt, because I think what we'll see is the Syrians joining hands again and pushing out the foreign invaders. And I think I feel that's maybe on the doorstep. Could start to happen any day. Perhaps starting in Homs, and that's the hope. Where the violence started, that's where the peace will start.
Father Dave, John, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. Coming up after the break is one of Russia Today's top analysts on the fighting in Ukraine. And he's a bit of a fighter himself. John White, after this.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Following the violent overthrow of an elected government, Ukraine is no longer a functioning state. It has a new government in Kiev, stuffed with right-wing nationalists and even fascists, which was elected by no one. In fact, many were essentially appointed by the US State Department's Victoria Nuland, who had previously boasted of spending $5 billion on democracy promotion in Ukraine.
The coup leaders aren't so tough outside of their Western-funded $5 billion square in Kiev, however, and have lost control of substantial parts of the country, which simply rejects their revolution. They seem to think that slaughter will stabilize the country, placing them, if it happens, on a collision course with Russia. John White, who analyses these and other matters for RT, joins us now. John, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. Are we headed for war over the Ukraine?
Well, it certainly looks closer than it's ever been, George. It's good that we've now, though, entered the diplomatic process wherein the four powers are sitting down to talk, the four powers being the US, the Russian governments, the EU, and the interim government in Ukraine. But when we say interim government, we need to unpack what we really mean. As Gayatri said at the top of this item, this was a government that came to power on the back of a violent coup wherein protesters started killing police officers, burning buildings, and they were described as pro-democracy activists. When people do that in eastern Ukraine in resistance to this undemocratic regime in Kiev, they're being denounced as terrorists and armed militants. So really what we're seeing is the hypocrisy of the West. And to be lectured to by the West on the evils of interfering in other countries' affairs is really like being told to sit up straight by the hunchback of Notre Dame. So it's good that there is a diplomatic process, but the Russian government so far has been very, very restrained, I would say. Their intervention in Crimea to restore the democratic rights of 2.5 million people, which were violated by the events in Kiev, has forestalled up to now a civil conflict which would have been inevitable. If this interim regime in Kiev had been allowed to bed in and to try and start trying to enforce its writ to the east of the country, there would inevitably have been civil conflict. Thus far that's been averted. Let's hope this diplomatic process can avert the possibility going forward.
Well, the people in the south and the east of Ukraine, Russian-speaking people, who constitute 47% of the entire population of Ukraine, they have no obligation whatsoever to recognize the governmental writ of a group of people who came to power through fire and sharp steel far away in Kiev.
It has absolutely no legitimacy, no basis in international law, and no basis on any democratic norm we know. So, but if you listen to the British media, you would think this event started with Russia's intervention in Crimea. They've completely abstracted the role of avowed fascists and neo-Nazis in this process. And let's be clear, we're not talking about a few nutcases running around working towns in England and so on in the ADL. We're talking about a part of the world where fascism has deep historical and cultural roots.
And the blood of millions on its hands.
Absolutely. So, as you say, the citizens of eastern Ukraine and Crimea have no obligation to obey the writ of this government in Kiev. So the country is certainly polarised, but I would suggest that the people of Western Crimea, the scales must be starting to fall from their eyes with regard to the role of the West. They were promised this new utopia of prosperity if they would move into a Western orbit, and what they've received now is nothing. They've received nothing but chaos. They've received nothing but the prospect of civil conflict, and it really does expose the West. The West
and no money, by the way.
No money, yes. So people like John McCain, who went over to Kiev, and Catherine Ashton, John McCain, who, by the way, belongs to the Yeehaw school of US foreign policy, wherein the world is reduced to the simplicity of a John Wayne movie, they have nothing to offer the Ukrainian people. This was part of their wider geopolitical struggle against the government of the Russian Federation. And the Russian Federation has drawn the line after years wherein the velvet glove of soft power concealed the iron fist of hard power. The Russian government isn't having it anymore, and quite rightly too, and it's much better for the world that that is the case. Unipolarity is crumbling as we speak, and multipolarity must take its place in order for the world to go forward, where universal human rights and international law and sovereignty means something.
Throughout Europe, people are protesting against austerity, marching throughout the streets everywhere, each country. And meanwhile, they're promising this loads of money to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do you think, despite the biased media, the public sees through this hypocrisy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we saw that in essence when it came to Syria, when the British government and the American government were joined together in what would effectively have been a military alliance with Al-Qaeda. And because of British public opinion, which fed US public opinion, they're sick of the wars, they're sick of the lies, they're sick of the double-dealing, they've seen through it. So cynicism is the victor here. There's a real cynicism in our political process because the disconnect between our politicians and our leaders has never been so great as with public opinion as it is now. They don't want to be interfering in other countries' affairs. They don't want to be supporting neo-Nazis and fascists. They understand that we need international law and we need parity of esteem for all governments.
Well, let me give you one that just occurred to me and I haven't heard before. In Greece, 2 weeks ago, all rallies and demonstrations were banned in the capital city of Athens because Angela Merkel was coming to dictate the terms of still more austerity for the people of Greece. The EU, meanwhile, is handing over billions of euros to an unelected junta in Kiev, whilst the Greek people are suffering and being banned from having their own Maidan. They couldn't have a demonstration in the central square in Athens because the police would have shot them down if they'd turned out. In fact, many of them tried to, and flames were the result.
Yes.
This whole package is filled with such contradiction and hypocrisy and double standards. What's going to happen? The people in eastern Ukraine are occupying public buildings, which are their public buildings. They don't belong to the unelected junta in Kiev. Kiev is threatening to kill them in an anti-terrorist operation. Russia doesn't want to have to come to their defense, but surely will if push comes to shove.
Well, the Russian government is not only is morally obligated to come to their defence, it would have to because its own security interests are now at stake and are now being risked. So I see going forward the only possibility is some sort of federation within Ukraine in which there's regional autonomy for different parts of the country, because most of the industries in the east, the miners in eastern Ukraine have come out in support of the anti-government protesters in eastern Ukraine who are occupying these buildings, which, as you say, morally belong to them. So I see going forward a political solution which involves a federated state in Ukraine. I think it's the only way that's going to avert civil conflict. But I really don't think that the people of eastern Ukraine are now going to go back and accept this interim regime, which is nothing more than a ragtag bunch of fascists and ultranationalists who have been elevated to a position of legitimacy by our own governments in the West. And that's the real crime in this affair.
These public buildings belong to the Ukrainian state, which no longer exists.
Yes.
Because its president, its presidency, its parliament were all overthrown in a Western-funded, violent coup d'etat.
Yes.
So if they belong to anybody, they belong to the people in Donetsk and elsewhere who are now occupying them. These are Russian-speaking people. the first act of the junta was to abolish the Russian language
Yes.
as an official language of the state.
Yes.
But I'm interested in this contradiction that you touched on earlier. They've effectively, the people in Western Ukraine have been marched up the hill
Yes.
by John McCain and the EU and the rest. But nobody's going to pay their bills. No. Nobody's going to keep their heating on.
No.
Nobody in the West is going to put potatoes on their plate.
Yes.
So they've actually been fooled.
Yes,
Just
they have.
like the Western public opinion has been partially fooled.
Yes. Well, what people don't know, because again, with the British media, the Russian government was subsidising gas supply to Ukraine. They were keeping the price artificially low in order to help the Ukrainian people and the economy, which was in the mire. Now, when they're saying that we're going to put up prices up to their market rates, they're being denounced as using gas as a weapon of terror and so on and so forth. So is the Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation said, Sergei Lavrov, the only statesman, in my opinion, in the world today worthy of that name. The hypocrisy is off the scale when it comes to the role of the Western governments and the rhetoric we're hearing from London and Washington and from Brussels. It's quite staggering to behold. And it's amazing to me that they think they can get away with this and that nobody will notice what they're doing. They're fomenting protests in Venezuela. Anti-government protests in Venezuela are being regaled as freedom fighters and so on. And yet, when they do that in eastern Ukraine against a violent coup which deposed a democratically elected government, we can't get away from that. This is not rhetoric. This is not propaganda. This just happens to be a fact. They're denounced as terrorists. This is cognitive dissonance writ large.
Now, changing shape.
Yes.
I said in the introduction you're a fighting man yourself. Boxing has a very bad name amongst, if you like, liberal circles. You and I believe that boxing is one of the most character-building,
Yes.
discipline-inducing
Yes.
pastimes that young men, women if they insist, young men
Yes.
can possibly have. We need a bit more boxing in societies like ours, don't we?
Well, if you go into any low-income community from London to Manila to Los Angeles, you'll find boxing gyms probably play as effective a role as a church down the street in saving souls. It really is a sport wherein the human spirit is elevated and ennobled. And the intimacy that takes place between two boxers after they've been in a fight, a few hard rounds, is something that no one who hasn't experienced it could understand. It really, you see a conjoining of the human spirit at that moment. And boxing is not about street fighting, it's not about thuggery, and indeed it's the very opposite of that. It's about self-discipline, it's about mutual respect, and it's about self-control.
Angela Merkel's got a fighter, his name is Klitschko. He's boxing out of the German corner in the Ukraine. How's he doing? Is his star on the wane?
In the pantheon of heavyweight champions who were in the political arena, I must say I much preferred Muhammad Ali's politics to Vladimir Klitschko's. Yeah.
John White, Russia Today analyst, thank you very much for joining us. Now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, I asked the people about Ukraine, and Steve Connor says that I have a rule of thumb guide concerning Ukraine. Whatever William Hague says, believe the opposite. And then Auntie Brainwash says that the West needs to paint Russia as the baddie to justify their own agenda to the Middle East. Russell Bland then says, if Obama keeps poking that bear with a stick, it's going to bite him on the
I think they're making a very big mistake provoking Russia in the way that they are. They tried it with the Georgia war. Russia called their bluff and is going to call their bluff over Ukraine too.
Yeah, again. Aaron Makepeace says about Syria that a transition to a new government cannot happen safely whilst foreign rebels still besiege the country. And Tom Fryer adds that whatever happens in Syria depends on Saudi-Iran relations, that it could be a long war of attrition, but at least Bandar is gone.
Well, you say Bandar is gone. He's been the man in charge of the Syria file for years. Then he went off on some kind of sabbatical. Then he came back, and now he's been sacked again, which all indicates that Saudi policy is in a state of chaos. They have fallen out with Qatar and with Turkey. So it's not just on the battlefield that the Syrian rebels are massacring each other, but their backers
are
all backstabbing each other and inside their backers.
That's all that we've got for this week.
Which unfortunately means that's the end of the show.
Stay in touch with us though on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.